I've literally just landed from Moscow, and interesting trip, as my trips to Russia always are. I've been traveling to Russia for about 15 years now. It was firstly in connection with the AIDS Foundation asset, which started in our family home around 30 years ago, seeking to prevent the spread of HIV, especially amongst young people and drug users and so on, and also to care for those affected. And asset today is in 15 countries, from places like Nigeria, Uganda, Zimbabwe. We've worked in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, we work in Belarus, Ukraine, India, Thailand, and so on. And Russia has been an area where we've trained many workers. We've had about 500 trained educators working across 11 and a half time zones. So that was my first exposure to Russia through a really important period, because 15 years ago, the economy of Russia was still only worth about 40% of what it was when the Iron Curtain collapsed. And my goodness, Russia was in a pretty poor state then. And it's really recovered in a gigantic way. So Moscow today is a vibrant city. I was there today as a speaker at a big innovation city, an enormous innovation site, the kind of scale of which I've not seen outside of the Middle East, actually. A gigantic project combining biotech, nanotech, infotech, just about every kind of other tech you can think of, green tech, every tech you can imagine. The theme was digital and how digital innovation will change the world. And in previous years, they had about 18,000 people come through that site from around 70 nations, looking at ways to improve the world with startups. It was tremendous to be exposed to this next generation of Russians. This is a generation that were born after the Iron Curtain, so they are now, they're now in their early to mid 30s, or they're in their early 20s. They don't really remember communism at all. They're a completely different generation from the 60-year-olds, and they are just the same as the people you'd meet in many ways in Sierra Leone, in Colombia, in Rio de Janeiro, in New York, in Paris, in Madrid. And it's easy, with all the things you read about Russia in the media, to think that, you know, Russia is some particular kind of place, it has a particular kind of foreign policy, it has a particular kind of agenda or an ethical code or lack of it or whatever. Quite honestly, Russia is a nation of over 100 million people. It has prided itself on being one of the most powerful military nations in the world for many, many decades. It takes credit for having defeated the forces of Nazi Germany in the Second World War. It believes that it had a more pivotal role in doing that than the combined might of the United States of America, the UK, and all the other allied nations. Now, as a result of that catastrophe in the Second World War, there has been a fear, if you like, about the vulnerability of the Soviet Union to invasion again. Remember that maybe 20 million Soviet citizens died in that conflict. That's an unimaginably greater number than the few 100,000 that died in the UK, for example. So Russia is a grand nation on every possible scale. You know, you look at the buildings, you look at the fact that the country spans across 11 and a half time zones. Yes, that's what will happen. If you travel from one end of Russia to another, you've got to correct your watch 11 times. You start off in Ukraine and you land up in China. This is an extraordinary nation. You go north and you land up in Canada because the distances between Siberia and Canada, the other side, are small because of the shape of the world at the top of the globe. It's a fascinating nation, full of resources, and in fact, that is one of the challenges for the country. You could say that around 30 to 40% of the economy is driven by oil and gas still, and actually Russia therefore experiences the same kind of curse that Saudi Arabia experiences, the Middle East, and all other mineral-rich nations, which is their currency is higher than it ought to be because they're exporting so much stuff that the world needs, and that means that all the other businesses that they have just can't export in quite the same way because, well, the ruble is higher than it would be without the oil and gas, let's put it like that. And that means that there's a premium for Russian companies looking to export to the West. Now, that's before you got all the shenanigans of the current situation with Ukraine, the retaking of Crimea by Russia, which of course was part of Russia in the 1950s, and all the consequences of that in terms of loss of trust, international tensions, sanctions, and much more important than sanctions is the flight of capital. You've got a massive flood of Russian money that just disappeared from the Russian economy, billions of dollars a year removed and invested in places like the London property market, Switzerland, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, anywhere other than Russia, just to get the money out. And that was followed by strict controls by the Russian authorities, which now make it extremely difficult for a Russian oligarch to invest some of their wealth outside of Russia. But exchange controls aren't enough. Most nations of the world, a significant proportion of the wealth actually comes from what we call foreign direct investment. It's small companies, mid-sized, large, it's pension funds, whatever it is, investing their money into countries where they think there's going to be a great return. And Russia is an emerging market. It's a huge population that needs infrastructure. It needs new schools, new colleges, new hospitals, new railways, new power stations. The process of regeneration of Russia that began after the collapse of communism is only half complete. And that requires foreign capital, foreign innovation, confidence in the international markets. So it's all very well to just lock up the Russian oligarch wealth and say it can't come out on the basis that much of that was generated during the collapse of communism when there was a lot of chaos in the country. But the real issue is, how does Russia attract foreign direct investment? Because it's almost completely dried up. I mean, I was at this very exciting entrepreneurs conference, but the chances of those companies getting investment into Russia is very small. Yes, it's true that some of those companies may pitch to angel investors in the United States. They may find a way to co-locate, to open offices in Europe or something like that, and they may attract all kinds of incubator type projects and things like that to help them. But foreign money coming into Russia, it's a bigger risk than, let's say, into Ukraine right now. It's a bigger risk than into Poland. It's a much bigger risk than into Germany or Switzerland or Malaysia or Singapore or Indonesia. These are the nations that people are choosing to go to. And markets are strange things. They only need a small shiver down the spine of fear, and they pull money out, they push it somewhere else. So a great challenge for President Putin is how to get the economy going again. And the Russian economy is soldering along. It's not in recession, but it's only growing 0.5%, maybe 1% this year. It's struggling. And President Putin's popularity, if you believe the polls, and it's difficult to know how objective they really are, but his popularity has fallen dramatically. Some would say from, 70% of the population 5 to 10 years ago saying he was the best thing ever, to only 30 or 40%. That's a huge change. So President Putin's capacity to maneuver is relatively limited. And what he's trying to do is to stimulate the economy with massive investment, around $400 billion into this and another $100 billion into that. The trouble is, as the United States found when the global economy crashed in 2008-9, it's really difficult for governments to stimulate investment. It's easy to make the announcement, but it's difficult to actually do it. The reason is that for governments to, let's say, invest $100 billion, it means you've got to sign off on an enormous project, like, let's say, a dam or a new nuclear power station. But even if you sign off, and it takes time to do that, it can take a year or two before a project to get fully underway. Let's take a project like Crossrail in the UK, which is a new metro running right under the city, which is going to revolutionize traffic going east and west. But the tunneling required has been enormously expensive to do. Crossrail has been built, well, it was planned over a decade ago. It started building actually around 7 years ago, I don't know, maybe 6. I lose track, but the fact is we've just added another year and a half onto the project length. You see, so even if you decide in year one of an economic crisis to to engage in stimulus, by the time you're actually pushing most of your money into the investment, you're in year 6 or 7, by which time the economy is properly recovered. So Russia is in a real difficulty regarding the economic stimulus that President Putin is looking for. It's very frustrating for them, just like it has been in many other nations around the world. So what else can they do? Well, they could reduce taxes. Actually, Russia's just increased the VAT rate. The VAT rate on all purchased goods has just gone up by 2%. That seems a little bit of an own goal in terms of slowing things down, discouraging expenditure and so on. It's a big challenge. One of the things you can try and do is to sell a lot more of your biggest exports. Well, in this particular case, it's oil and gas. And the way to do that is just increase pumping. Pump, 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 and to hell with the price. Let the price fall as low as you like. Well, that's okay, but it has several consequences. The first is that if the oil prices collapse as a result of doing that, then it's again a bit of an own goal. Instead of scoring, let's say, $80 per barrel of oil that you ship out, you're suddenly scoring only $40 a barrel. Then what happens? And the other problem is, that is a one-off reserve. You can't make any more oil. You can't make any more gas. It's gone. So for Russia to deliberately go on pumping just to kind of stimulate the economy and help the ruble, it's quite short-sighted. It's the same kind of short-sightedness as that we've seen in Saudi Arabia recently. Saudi Arabia can't balance the books in its own economy without producing a lot more oil and gas. The trouble is, every time it tries to do so, the prices of the very stuff it's trying to sell fall through the floor. So what it means is this: we're a bit stuck. Oh, there's another thing President Putin could do: spend a lot of money on military spending. Yeah, okay, let's pump out a whole load, 100,000 more trucks and 10,000 more tanks and all the rest of it. Well, firstly, that also takes a bit of time to gear up, but actually that was one of the first things that President Putin did. But it's more or less come to an end. I mean, they've done it. In fact, the Russians are now winding down their replacement and regeneration of their rather aged military infrastructure. It's a bit of a fix, and if I was in President Putin's situation right now, I would find myself quite uncomfortable, because the people need economic growth. They are expecting it. They have been led to expect it. They've had it. They've enjoyed it. But for the last 4 or 5 years, actually, the amount of money that individuals have had in Russia to spend has gone down by 5 or 10 or 15%. It depends how you measure it. It depends who you are. But the reason is that inflation has gone higher than wages. There have been all kinds of pressures in the economy. It's partly a reflection of the fact that the ruble collapsed. Why did the ruble collapse? Because no one wanted to buy rubles. Everyone was trying to sell rubles, and the sanctions made that even greater as an issue. So what does it mean for the longer term future? Well, what it means is this: that Russia can't really afford another great big military adventure that would extend whatever sanctions there are still in place for another 5 to 10 years. Russia can't really afford to antagonize the investor community. Forget about the governments for a moment, but your average pension fund manager. I've been in audiences where there have been $1 trillion of pension funds under management right in front of me. Those are the kinds of people that President Putin needs to appeal to. He needs to be able to say, look, Russia's a great place to invest. You can happily put 5% of your entire pension fund there. It's probably one of the most exciting markets, but they're just not going to do it right now. So that's the challenge. It's all about trust linked to emotion. And President Putin, therefore, needs to not only give regard to the trust in and confidence inside the country, but also internationally. And trust is going to take a bit of time to rebuild, because every headline there is about undermining the American elections, whether it's true or false, and I happen to think there's probably quite a lot of it was true, based on the evidence as far as I can see. Every headline like that undermines trust. Every headline that the current Brexit votes or the European Union elections, again, are being manipulated by Russia, undermines trust. Now, President Putin could argue, well, the Americans and CIA have been doing this to America doing this to Russia for decades, and that is probably true. That the CIA probably has been investing all kinds of money and all kinds of plans to undermine President Putin if they can, and get him replaced by some other candidate they think will be more favorable to American foreign policy. That was at least before Donald Trump got in, because he seems to think, I think, that President Putin is rather good for American foreign policy. But leaving that aside, President Putin has a point. that every superpower has probably been manipulating other superpowers' agendas, political campaigns, assassinating rogue operatives in foreign soil, and all kinds of murky things going on. So Russia's not the only bad boy here. But how does Russia get out of this mess? Well, as I say, Russia's going to need to find its own answers to that. I'm not going to dictate to Russia what it should do. I'll just say that it's a stark, ravingly lunatic, obvious fact that the Russian economy is unlikely to grow very much unless trust in the Russian economy is restored in the international community, in the eyes of the international investors. And that is going to take about 3 or 4 years, I think, of a calming down of what some have called another Cold War. I don't think it is a Cold War. In fact, honestly, those who call it another Cold War have no idea what the old Cold War was like. You couldn't even travel to Moscow. It was very difficult. There was almost complete lockdown of travel across the border of the Iron Curtain. It was a dismal world where there was a gigantic cultural divide between communism and its centralized economy and capitalism. But Russia's a capitalist country today. It's a vibrant, dynamic capitalist state. It officially supports democracy. It, on paper, shares very, very large numbers of the same values or similar values to our Western nations in a much more similar way, shall I say, than was the case, let's say, in 1985. So, Cold War, you can think about, I would say, that's the wrong word, hybrid war, yes, hybrid conflict, yes. I've written a whole chapter on this in my latest book, The Future of Almost Everything. Hybrid conflicts, yes, where you're not quite sure who the adversary is, where mercenaries are fighting for all kinds of people, you're not really sure who's paying them, where a lot of it's soft propaganda, fake news, manipulation of social media, bribery of politicians, all kinds of devices being used. But Russia's not the only one. Being used by many governments now around the world to further their own national interests. And Russia has been a very, very skilled example of this. So it's a complicated situation. I was glad to go there. Some might say, well, you shouldn't travel. I think the more travel there is in the world, the less likely we'll see another world war, personally. I think the more travel there is in the world, the more people get a glimpse of what civilization in the third millennium should be all about. They create pressures on their own governments for change, for reform, for human rights, for whatever it is. They catch a glimpse of different ways of living, even just a tiny thing. I go into an airport of a country that I don't think is particularly sensitized to the needs of those who are challenged in their mobility, and I find that there's disabled toilets, and there's disabled this, and there's disabled that in the airports. I say hallelujah. Maybe when I go into the hotels, I'll find the same, and I do, because they're designed for foreigners. And then I find actually it's the same in their museums for tourists. Great. And then I find it's the same in their national hospitals, because of local campaigns that they see these things elsewhere and they think that we should have them in our own nation. So what we're seeing is a homogenization, if you like, of global standards when it comes to normal ways of behaving, the rule of law, respect for free speech, for minorities, for the disadvantaged, support for the vulnerable. These are becoming more widely spread values, and I think that's a really good thing. So, those are my reflections on Russia. Very glad I went. Exciting city. Don't ever underestimate Moscow or all the talent that's there.